Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Montgomery. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time at which you are listening to this narration. We are interested to know to which places and at what times of day or night these documented stories reach. The year was 1851, when the disappearance occurred. Montgomery, Alabama was a city of stark contrasts, with grand columned homes rising above streets where human beings were bought and sold daily. It was during this time that something happened at the Turner plantation, located 17 miles east of the city proper, something that would remain buried in county records and whispered about for decades to come. The Turner estate was known for its profitable cotton fields and the family's prominence in Montgomery society. Josiah Turner, aged 44, had inherited the plantation from his father in 1838. He was known as a businessman of considerable talent, having expanded the estate's holdings to over 600 acres. His wife, Eleanor Pierce Turner, aged 39, was the daughter of a wealthy Charleston family. The couple maintained a respectable position in local society, attending St. John's Episcopal Church every Sunday and hosting summer socials that drew attendance from as far as Mobile. What separated the Turners from many of their contemporaries was not their wealth, which was substantial but not extraordinary, but rather the unusual quietness of their household. Visitors often remarked on the strange silence that seemed to permeate the estate. According to records from the Montgomery County Historical Society, the plantation employed 28 enslaved persons, yet guests would comment on how they rarely saw or heard any activity beyond the main house. According to the 1850 census, the Turner household included only the couple themselves, no children having been born to their union after 13 years of marriage. Eleanor Turner was known to participate in charitable works through the church, though acquaintances noted she seldom spoke of personal matters. One neighbor, Martha Whitfield, was quoted in an 1862 letter as saying, "Mrs. Turner carries herself with such stillness as though she moves through the world, bearing a weight invisible to others." County records indicate that on April 7, 1851, Josiah Turner reported the disappearance of an enslaved person, identified in documents only as Samuel, aged approximately 24. What distinguished this report from similar notifications of the era was Turner's unusual insistence on involving the county sheriff, Richard Holcomb. Such matters were typically handled privately by plantation owners, particularly when they involved what was legally considered property. Sheriff Holcomb's log, preserved in the Alabama Department of Archives and History, notes his initial reluctance to allocate resources to the matter. "Mr. Turner exhibits an uncommon agitation regarding the absence of his property," the sheriff wrote. While such concern might be warranted for a valuable asset, his manner suggests something beyond mere financial consideration. The sheriff's visit to the Turner plantation was documented in both official records and his personal journal, the latter discovered during a renovation of the old county courthouse in 1963. In it, he describes the Turner home as meticulously maintained, yet bearing an atmosphere of unease that even the spring breeze coming through the open windows could not dispel. What happened next would begin to unravel a tapestry of silence that had been carefully maintained for years. 3 days after the initial report, on April 10th, a storm caused significant damage throughout the county. A large oak on the Turner property was uprooted, exposing a patch of disturbed earth that had been hidden beneath its sprawling roots. According to sheriff's records, a field hand discovered what appeared to be human remains while clearing the fallen tree. Sheriff Holcomb was summoned back to the plantation immediately. His official report states that the remains were in a condition suggesting interment of no more than 4 to 6 months. This timeline created an immediate discrepancy, as no deaths or disappearances had been reported from the Turner plantation during that period. The discovery prompted a more thorough investigation of the property. What followed was unusual for its time, a search of a prominent citizen's estate. Such an action would normally have faced significant resistance from the planter class, who maintained considerable autonomy over their land and what occurred upon it. However, according to court records, Josiah Turner offered no objection to the search, stating only that the truth must be known, whatever it may reveal. Eleanor Turner's reaction was recorded quite differently. The sheriff's deputy, Thomas Mercer, noted that Mrs. Turner remained seated in the parlor, her hands folded in her lap, making no comment nor showing any distress as the men moved through her home. This unnatural calm would later be remarked upon by several witnesses. The search of the grounds yielded nothing of immediate concern until attention turned to a small outbuilding that stood apart from the slave quarters. According to inventory records from 1849, the structure was designated as a storage space for tools and seed. However, when officers entered, they found the building's interior had been modified. The floor had been excavated to create a space approximately 6 feet deep. A crude ladder provided access to this pit. Sheriff Holcomb's personal journal provides the most detailed account of what was discovered. The space below contains evidence of prolonged human habitation, a pallet of straw, a container for waste, and scratches upon the wall that appear to mark the passage of time. The confined nature of the space and the manner of its construction suggest it served as a place of confinement rather than shelter. When questioned about the structure, Josiah Turner reportedly claimed no knowledge of its modified state, suggesting that it must have been altered without his awareness. This explanation was received with skepticism, as plantation owners typically maintained strict control over any changes to their property. More troubling was the discovery of a small journal hidden within the earthen wall of the pit. The journal, later authenticated as belonging to Eleanor Turner based on handwriting comparison with her correspondence, contained entries dating back 3 years. The contents were described by examining officials as disturbing in their detached recounting of suffering. Specific details were omitted from public records, but references in later court documents suggest the journal detailed observations of human confinement and what was termed experimental modification of behavior. On April 15, 1851, both Josiah and Eleanor Turner were taken into custody. The charges, unusual for the time, related not to the treatment of enslaved persons, which sadly carried little legal weight, but to the suspected murder of 2 white overseers who had been employed by the plantation and had allegedly departed for opportunities further west in 1849 and 1850. The remains discovered beneath the oak were eventually identified as belonging to Jonathan Reed, age 37, who had served as overseer on the Turner plantation from 1846 until his supposed departure in October 1849. Identification was confirmed through dental records and personal effects found with the body. The cause of death was determined to be a severe fracture to the skull. The subsequent investigation led to a search for the second overseer, William Sloan, age 41. According to plantation records, Sloan had been hired shortly after Reed's departure and had himself left in July of 1850. No record of Sloan's employment elsewhere could be found, despite inquiries sent as far as Mississippi and Louisiana. It was during this phase of the investigation that Samuel, the enslaved man whose disappearance had initiated the entire sequence of events, reappeared. He was found walking along a road nearly 30 miles from the Turner plantation, disoriented and showing signs of malnourishment. When brought before the sheriff, his testimony opened a window into the true nature of what had transpired at the Turner estate. Due to the laws of the time, Samuel's testimony could not be used in court against white persons. However, his account was recorded in Sheriff Holcomb's private papers. According to these documents, Samuel described being selected by Mrs. Turner for what she termed special service in the main house. This position, coveted for its removal from field labor, quickly revealed itself to be something far more sinister. Samuel reported being confined to the modified outbuilding for periods of up to 3 days, during which time he was subjected to various forms of psychological manipulation. He described Mrs. Turner as speaking to him through a small opening in the ceiling of the pit, sometimes reading passages from scientific texts, other times simply observing his reactions to prolonged isolation, darkness, or exposure to the elements. Most disturbing was Samuel's account of witnessing the death of Overseer Reed. According to his testimony, Reed had discovered Mrs. Turner's activities and confronted her husband. The confrontation escalated, and Reed was struck with a fireplace implement. Samuel stated that he was forced to assist in the disposal of the body, digging the grave beneath the oak tree under cover of night. A similar fate allegedly befell William Sloane, though Samuel had only indirect knowledge of this event, having been confined during its occurrence. He claimed to have overheard the Turners discussing the need to address the Sloane situation, after the overseer began asking questions about Reed's abrupt departure and the strange sounds sometimes heard from the outbuilding. Samuel's escape had occurred during a moment of carelessness by Josiah Turner, who had failed to secure the pit's hatch properly. After fleeing the plantation, Samuel had wandered for days, afraid to approach anyone for fear of being returned to the Turners. The case against the Turners proceeded slowly, hampered by their social standing and the reluctance of authorities to accept the word of an enslaved person, even in matters concerning crimes against white victims. However, the physical evidence, particularly Eleanor's journal and the remains of Jonathan Reed, provided sufficient basis for continued investigation. As news of the case spread through Montgomery society, other accounts began to emerge. Former guests at the Turner home recalled unusual restrictions on which parts of the property they could visit. A previous house servant, now working in another household, described hearing cries that were quickly silenced coming from the direction of the outbuilding late at night. Perhaps most damning was the testimony of Dr. Robert Wilson, who had attended Eleanor Turner for what Josiah had described as nervous episodes. Dr. Wilson's medical notes submitted to the court detailed conversations in which Mrs. Turner had spoken at length about her interest in the thresholds of human endurance and the science of breaking and remaking the human spirit. The doctor had attributed these disturbing statements to the laudanum he had prescribed for her condition. The trial of Josiah and Eleanor Turner began on September 3, 1851. It lasted 11 days, an unusually long proceeding for the era. Eleanor Turner maintained a composed demeanor throughout, reportedly making detailed notes during witness testimony and whispering frequent instructions to her attorney. Josiah, by contrast, appeared increasingly agitated as the evidence mounted. On the 9th day of the trial, in a dramatic turn of events, Josiah Turner changed his plea to guilty, simultaneously offering a full confession that implicated his wife as the architect of the horrors that had occurred on their property. According to court transcripts, he claimed to have participated only out of fear of Eleanor, who he described as possessing a coldness of mind that masks an unnatural fascination with suffering. Eleanor Turner's response to this betrayal was recorded simply as a long, assessing look at her husband before returning to her notes without comment. When given the opportunity to speak in her own defense, she declined, stating only that future minds will better understand the necessity of my inquiries. On September 14, 1851, Josiah Turner was sentenced to death for the murders of Jonathan Reed and William Sloane, whose body had still not been recovered, but whose death was considered proven by circumstantial evidence. Eleanor Turner was likewise sentenced to death, an unusual punishment for a woman of her social standing at that time. The executions were scheduled for November 12, 1851. However, historical records indicate that only Josiah Turner was hanged on that date. Eleanor Turner was found dead in her cell on the morning of November 3rd. The official cause was recorded as failure of the heart, though rumors persisted that she had somehow obtained poison. A final disturbing epilogue to the case emerged during the winter of 1851. Workers demolishing the outbuilding on the former Turner property discovered a sealed space beneath the floorboards of the structure, separate from the pit that had already been identified. Within this space were found human remains, later identified as those of William Sloane. Alongside the remains was a leather-bound book containing what appeared to be Eleanor Turner's observations, written in a meticulous hand, documenting what she called the progressive phases of isolation's effect on the rational mind. The Turner case faded from public record relatively quickly, perhaps intentionally obscured by a society uncomfortable with its implications. The plantation was sold, its name changed, and its history deliberately forgotten. It was not until 1963 when a graduate student at Auburn University named Margaret Coleman discovered Sheriff Holcomb's personal papers while researching antebellum law enforcement practices that the case returned to scholarly attention. Coleman's thesis, titled The Silent House, Power, Cruelty, and Scientific Curiosity in the Antebellum South, provided the first comprehensive analysis of the Turner case. Her work suggested that Eleanor Turner's actions represented an early, unrecognized example of systematic psychological torture conducted under the guise of scientific inquiry. Coleman noted disturbing parallels between the methods described in Eleanor's writings and techniques that would later be documented in more formal settings during the 20th century. The Turner plantation house itself no longer stands, having been destroyed by fire in 1878. The land has since been subdivided and developed, with no physical marker of the events that transpired there. Local historians have occasionally proposed a memorial to acknowledge the suffering that occurred on the site, particularly that of the enslaved persons subjected to the Turners' cruelty, but such efforts have never gained sufficient support. Samuel, whose courage in escaping and testifying played a crucial role in bringing the Turners to justice, disappears from historical record after the trial. No documentation of his fate has been discovered, though local oral histories collected from black communities in Montgomery County in the 1960s include stories of a man who returned from a living burial and later helped others escape north. The journal containing Eleanor Turner's observations was reportedly stored in the Montgomery County Courthouse until 1954, when it went missing during a reorganization of the archives. Its current whereabouts remain unknown, though rumors periodically surface of private collectors in possession of what they claim to be the original manuscript or copies of its contents. What remains most disturbing about the Turner case is not merely the acts themselves, but the environment that allowed them to occur undetected for so long. The power structures of the antebellum South, particularly the legal and social framework of slavery, created conditions where such horrors could be perpetrated behind a veil of respectability. The Turners' position in society afforded them a presumption of virtue that delayed scrutiny until the evidence became impossible to ignore. In 1969, Dr. James Harrison, a professor of psychology at Tuskegee University, published an analysis of the Turner case based on the available historical documents. He suggested that Eleanor Turner's actions represented a disturbing convergence of pseudo-scientific curiosity and the moral corruption inherent in a system that reduced human beings to property. Harrison noted that similar patterns of behavior have emerged in other closed systems, where absolute power over others exists without accountability. The last known person to have direct connection to the case was Catherine Mercer, granddaughter of Deputy Thomas Mercer, who had participated in the search of the Turner property. In an interview conducted in 1967, when she was 93 years old, Catherine recalled her grandfather's reluctance to discuss the case. He would only say that there are some things that human beings should not be permitted to do to one another, and that he had seen such things at the Turner place, she stated. Whatever he witnessed there troubled him until the end of his days. Today, the Turner case exists primarily as a footnote in academic studies of crime in the antebellum South. The absence of complete records, the deliberate obscuring of details by contemporaries uncomfortable with their implications, and the inability of the enslaved victims to document their experiences in their own words have all contributed to the case's relative obscurity. Yet the echoes of what occurred on that plantation continue to resonate, a reminder of humanity's capacity for cruelty when power remains unchecked and the suffering of the vulnerable goes unacknowledged. Perhaps the most fitting memorial to the victims of the Turner plantation is not a physical marker, but a commitment to recognize and confront such abuses wherever they may arise. For those who study the darker chapters of American history, the Turner case stands as a warning about the consequences of granting unchecked authority and the dangers of allowing scientific curiosity to operate outside of ethical constraints. It reminds us that true horror resides not in supernatural forces, but in the choices made by ordinary people when they come to view others as less than human. The old oak tree that once stood on the Turner property, the one whose fall revealed the first evidence of what lay beneath the surface, was reportedly cut up and the wood burned after the trial concluded. No one wanted material from that place in their homes. Some boundaries, once crossed, leave permanent marks on the landscapes they occupied, whether those marks remain visible or not. The silence that visitors once noted at the Turner plantation has, in its way, extended across time. The voices of those who suffered there have largely been lost, their experiences recorded, if at all, by the very people who caused their pain. In that silence lies perhaps the greatest horror of all. Not just what was done, but how easily it was hidden and how completely many of its details have been forgotten. And yet, something remains. In the Montgomery County Historical Society's archives, among the tax records and property deeds of the 1850s, there is a single page torn from what appears to be a personal diary. The handwriting matches samples of Eleanor Turner's correspondence. It contains just one sentence. They think the greatest pain lies in physical suffering, but I have found it lives in the mind, in the spaces between what was and what might be. Some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed again. The investigation into the Turner case might have ended with the deaths of Josiah and Eleanor, but certain details continued to surface in the decades that followed. In 1863, during the height of the Civil War, Union soldiers occupying Montgomery discovered a locked chest in the attic of a home that had once belonged to Eleanor Turner's attorney, Hamilton Brooks. The contents, catalogued by a Union captain with an interest in legal matters, included correspondence between Eleanor and Brooks dating back to 1847. These letters, now preserved in fragmentary form at the Library of Congress, reveal a disturbing evolution in Eleanor's thinking. In the earliest communications, she discusses what she terms the psychology of servitude with clinical detachment. By 1849, her language had shifted dramatically. She writes of breakthrough moments, when subjects, she never uses the word people, transcend their understanding of themselves as autonomous beings. Brooks apparently never reported these concerning exchanges to authorities, protected as they were by attorney-client privilege. His own marginalia on the letters, however, show increasing discomfort. On one letter dated January 1850, he wrote, "Mrs. T's academic interests take a troubling turn. advised greater discretion in both action and correspondence. The discovery of these letters prompted a brief resurgence of interest in the case among Union officials, but with the war still raging and more pressing concerns at hand, no formal reinvestigation was launched. The matter was noted and filed away, becoming another piece of the fragmented historical record. In 1872, a physician named Dr. Elias Thornton published an article in a medical journal discussing what he called the boundaries of scientific inquiry. Without mentioning the Turner case by name, he referenced a recent instance in the South wherein a woman of education perverted scientific curiosity toward inhumane ends. Thornton argued that such cases highlighted the need for ethical oversight within the scientific community, a remarkably progressive position for the time. Research conducted in 1958 by historian Rebecca Mills uncovered evidence that Dr. Thornton had been a cousin of Eleanor Pierce Turner, having grown up with her in Charleston. Family correspondence suggests he had visited the Turner plantation in 1848 and left abruptly after only 2 days, cancelling plans for a longer stay. He never publicly acknowledged this connection to the case. Perhaps one of the most unsettling aspects of the Turner case is how it prefigured later, more systematic abuses of scientific authority. Eleanor Turner's private experiments, conducted without oversight or ethical constraint, bear disturbing similarities to studies that would be formally sanctioned in the century that followed. Her detailed records of psychological breaking points, isolation effects, and methodologies for inducing compliance seem almost prophetic of techniques that would later be refined in institutional settings. Archaeologist Martin Whitaker, conducting a survey of the former Turner property in 1965 prior to commercial development, discovered what appeared to be a root cellar not documented in the original investigation. Within the space, which had been partially filled by soil over the decades, he found fragments of glass containers, some still bearing partial labels, from apothecaries in Charleston and Richmond. Analysis of residue from these containers identified compounds used in various sedatives and hallucinogens known to the medical community of the 1850s. This discovery added a new dimension to understanding Eleanor Turner's methods. The journal entries previously recovered had made reference to administering preparations to heighten suggestibility, but had not specified their nature. The physical evidence suggested that her approach combined psychological manipulation with chemical inducements, an especially advanced methodology for the period. The combination of isolation, psychological pressure, and chemical influence creates conditions particularly conducive to breaking down established patterns of thought and behavior. Modern experts who have reviewed the available documentation from the Turner case have noted similarities to techniques later documented in various contexts where coercive control was the objective. What makes the Turner case particularly distinctive was Eleanor's apparent scientific approach. Unlike others who might have employed cruelty for its own sake or for simple control, Eleanor Turner's meticulous documentation suggests she viewed herself as conducting legitimate research. Her background, while not including formal scientific training, which would have been largely inaccessible to women of her era, did include extensive private education. Inventory records of the Turner household listed numerous medical and scientific texts unusual for a plantation library. Professor Amelia Richardson of Howard University, in a 1967 paper analyzing the Turner case, suggested that Eleanor represented a dark mirror of the scientific exclusion of her time. Denied formal participation in the scientific community due to her gender, she created her own unsanctioned laboratory where her authority was absolute. The tragedy extends beyond her victims to include what such an intellect might have contributed had it been properly channeled and ethically guided, Richardson wrote. The 1860 census recorded that 21 people remained enslaved on the Turner plantation after the arrests, most of whom were sold to settle estate claims after the executions. County records provide no indication that any special consideration was given to those who had been subjected to Eleanor Turner's experiments. They simply vanished into the larger enslaved population, their specific traumatic experiences unacknowledged by the legal system that disposed of them as property. Oral histories collected from descendants of enslaved communities in Montgomery County include stories that may connect to the Turner case, though names and specific details have been altered through generations of retelling. Several accounts mention a witch woman who collected souls in bottles and a pit where people went in whole and came out hollow. These narratives, while not historically verifiable in their details, speak to the lasting impact of the trauma on community memory. The Turner plantation house itself became the subject of local superstition in the years following the trial. Though historical records confirm it remained standing until destroyed by fire in 1878, multiple accounts from the interim period describe it as abandoned or avoided despite documented occupancy by subsequent owners. A letter from 1865, written by the property's then-owner, James Merrill, complains of difficulty retaining household staff due to persistent and irrational fears associated with the property's history. The fire that eventually destroyed the house was determined to be the result of lightning strike during a severe summer storm. Contemporary newspaper accounts note that despite the house's proximity to town, no substantial effort was made to save the structure once it became clear that no lives were at risk. One reporter observed that spectators watched with what might be described as grim satisfaction as the flames consumed what many have long considered a place of dark history. In 1883, the land was purchased by a cotton merchant named William Hayes, who divided it into smaller parcels and sold them to tenant farmers, effectively erasing the physical boundaries that had once defined the Turner plantation. This fragmentation of the property coincided with broader changes in land use patterns following the Civil War and Reconstruction, as the plantation system gave way to new arrangements of ownership and labor. The physical dispersal of the land paralleled the scattering of information about what had occurred there. With no central repository for records related to the case and many principals deceased or relocated, knowledge of the Turner atrocities became increasingly fragmented. By the turn of the century, it had largely faded from public consciousness, surviving primarily in academic archives and local oral tradition. This pattern of forgetting and rediscovery has characterized the Turner case throughout its historical trajectory. Periodically, some new piece of evidence emerges, a letter in a private collection, a journal entry in an unrelated archive, an account recorded from a descendant, that brings the case temporarily back into focus before it once again recedes from view. In 1947, construction workers excavating for a commercial building on what had once been the eastern edge of the Turner property uncovered a collection of small glass bottles buried approximately 4 feet below the surface. Each contained a folded piece of paper, and each paper bore a single name, written in what handwriting experts later identified as Eleanor Turner's distinctive script. The names did not correspond to any individuals documented in census or property records associated with the Turner household. When this discovery was publicized in the Montgomery Advertiser, an elderly woman named Sarah Johnson came forward with information passed down from her grandmother, who had been enslaved on a neighboring plantation. According to this family account, Eleanor Turner was known to take the names of those subjected to her experiments, telling them they would no longer need their identities where they were going. The buried bottles, containing what Eleanor allegedly called the discarded selves, may represent a ritualistic component to her activities not documented in the official record. This account, while impossible to verify conclusively, aligns with journal fragments in which Eleanor wrote of subjects reaching what she termed the point of identity surrender. The physical evidence of the buried bottles suggests that her methodology included symbolic as well as practical elements, perhaps aimed at reinforcing the psychological impact of her techniques. By the mid-20th century, the story of the Turner plantation had evolved into something of an academic curiosity, occasionally referenced in specialized studies, but largely unknown to the general public. This changed somewhat in 1969, with the publication of historian Charles Morgan's book, The Science of Cruelty, the Turner Case, and the Roots of Modern Psychological Manipulation. Morgan's work placed the case in broader historical context, arguing that it represented not an aberration, but an early example of tendencies that would later manifest in more institutionalized forms. Morgan's research benefited from the discovery of a collection of letters written by Sheriff Richard Holcomb to his brother in Virginia. These letters, more detailed and candid than his official reports, describe Holcomb's growing horror as the investigation progressed. "I have seen battlefields and hangings," he wrote in May 1851, "but never have I encountered such calculated coldness. Mrs. According to his letters, many displayed unusual behavioral patterns, including an extreme reluctance to speak in the presence of white authorities, beyond what would be typical for the time, physical flinching at certain words or phrases, and what he described as an absence behind the eyes, as though the person to whom one speaks is somewhere else entirely." These observations, made by a man with no formal training in psychology but considerable experience observing human behavior, in his law enforcement role, suggest the far-reaching impact of Eleanor Turner's experiments on those who survived them. Turner spoke of her activities with the detachment one might use to discuss crop rotation or the breeding of horses. Particularly noteworthy is Holcomb's account of interviewing other enslaved people from the Turner plantation. The effects he described align remarkably well with what modern clinicians would recognize as symptoms of severe psychological trauma. In 1964, during the height of the civil rights movement, a group of students and faculty from Alabama State College, now Alabama State University, attempted to organize a memorial service for the victims of the Turner plantation. Their efforts met with resistance from local authorities, who cited concerns about inflaming historical grievances during an already tense period. The service was ultimately held on campus rather than at the former plantation site, with participants reading aloud the names of all individuals known to have been enslaved by the Turners, including those whose fates remained undocumented. This act of remembrance represented one of the first attempts to center the experiences of the primary victims rather than focusing on the sensational aspects of the case or the psychological profile of Eleanor Turner. It marked a shift in how the Turner case would be discussed in subsequent scholarly work, with increasing attention paid to the resilience and agency of those who endured and sometimes resisted the Turners' cruelty. In 1972, linguist Dr. Patricia Coleman published an analysis of the fragments of Eleanor Turner's writings that had been preserved. She identified what she called a progressive dehumanization in language choice over time, with early entries referring to subjects and later ones using terms like specimens and materials. This linguistic shift tracked with the escalation in Eleanor's experimental methods, suggesting a self-reinforcing pattern in which changes in language both reflected and enabled increasing moral disengagement. Perhaps the most complete picture of what occurred at the Turner plantation comes not from any single source, but from the composite created by these various fragments: official records, private correspondence, oral histories, physical evidence, and scholarly analysis. Like a mosaic viewed from a distance, the individual pieces come together to form a coherent and disturbing image of systematic cruelty, justified by pseudoscientific rationalization and enabled by the broader social context of slavery. The case raises uncomfortable questions about the relationship between scientific inquiry and ethical constraints, questions that remain relevant long after the specific circumstances of the Turner plantation have passed into history. Eleanor Turner's actions occurred within a system that already denied full humanity to those she subjected to her experiments. The step from legally sanctioned dehumanization to the extremes she pursued was shorter than might be comfortably acknowledged. In 2003, a dissertation by doctoral student Marcus Jenkins at the University of Alabama examined county records and property transactions to track the subsequent lives of the 21 people who remained enslaved on the Turner plantation after the arrests. His research found that 14 were sold to a plantation in Mississippi, 4 to various buyers in Alabama, and 3 to a cotton operation in Georgia. After emancipation, census records from 1870 and 1880 identified 7 individuals whose ages and names matched those from the Turner property, suggesting they had survived to experience freedom. One of these survivors, a woman recorded in the 1850 census as Maria, age 23, and in the 1870 census as Maria Dawson, age 43, left a rare first-person account of life after the Turner plantation. In a narrative recorded by a Freedmen's Bureau agent in 1868, she described the lasting effects of her experience. "There are nights still when I wake believing I am back in that place, where the mistress would speak through the ceiling like the voice of God, telling me I was nothing, no one, until I almost believed it. Freedom means I can say my name out loud and know it belongs to me alone." This testimony stands as perhaps the most direct window into the experience of those subjected to Eleanor Turner's psychological experimentation. It speaks to both the profound trauma inflicted and the remarkable resilience of the human spirit in the face of systematic attempts to break it. The final known reference to the Turner case in the 19th century appears in an 1897 medical journal, where a physician discussing disorders of the mind references the notorious Alabama case as an example of how prolonged isolation and psychological pressure can produce effects similar to physical trauma, though leaving no visible marks. This recognition of the reality of psychological injury, still an evolving concept in medical literature of the time, suggests the case's lasting impact on understanding of mental health. As the 20th century progressed, the Turner case occasionally resurfaced in academic literature, examining the history of psychology, the legacy of slavery, or the evolution of ethical standards in scientific research. Each new generation of scholars brought fresh perspectives and analytical frameworks to the limited evidence that survived. In 1977, archaeologist Deborah Williams conducted a systematic survey of what historical records indicated had been the location of the outbuilding where much of Eleanor Turner's experimentation took place. Though the structure itself was long gone and the area had been repurposed multiple times in the intervening years, ground-penetrating radar identified what appeared to be a rectangular subsurface anomaly corresponding to the dimensions of the pit described in sheriff's records. Excavation revealed fragments of the original structure's foundation and, more significantly, small personal items apparently concealed by those confined there. A button, a smooth stone, a piece of carved wood. Williams suggested these represented tiny assertions of humanity in a space designed to strip it away. The recovered items were eventually housed in the Alabama Department of Archives and History, where they remain today. humble artifacts that speak to the human capacity to maintain some sense of self, even under the most dehumanizing conditions. In 1986, historian Robert Thompson published what remains the most comprehensive analysis of the Turner case, The Pit and the Pendulum of Justice, Revisiting the Turner Atrocities. His work benefited from the accumulated research of previous scholars and from newly digitized newspaper archives that provided additional contemporary accounts. Thompson placed particular emphasis on the unusual legal response to the case, noting that in a system designed to protect the interests of enslavers, the prosecution of the Turners represents a rare instance where the boundaries of acceptable behavior were deemed to have been crossed, even within the morally corrupt framework of slavery. Thompson's analysis highlighted the significance of the fact that the Turners were ultimately prosecuted not for their treatment of enslaved people, but for the murders of white overseers who had discovered their activities. This legal reality underscores the profound moral bankruptcy of the antebellum legal system, which could recognize the wrong of murder in some instances, while systematically denying the humanity of enslaved individuals. The Turner case thus stands as both an individual horror and a window into the larger systemic horrors of American slavery. Eleanor Turner's particular brand of calculated cruelty represented an extreme expression of a dehumanization that was already embedded in the legal and social structures of the society in which she operated. As we approach the present day, the Turner case has gradually emerged from historical obscurity through the accumulated efforts of researchers, archivists, and community historians. The fragments of evidence that survive continue to yield new insights when examined with contemporary analytical tools and perspectives. Digital humanities projects have helped to collect and connect dispersed records, creating more comprehensive understandings of events previously glimpsed only partially. In 2012, ground was broken for a memorial park near the site of the former Turner plantation. The memorial, completed in 2014, does not focus specifically on the Turner case, but rather commemorates all those who were enslaved in Montgomery County. A small plaque acknowledges the particular atrocities associated with the Turner name, stating simply that, on this land, human cruelty reached exceptional depths, but human resilience proved deeper still. The story of the Turner plantation reminds us that true horror resides not in supernatural phenomena, but in the human capacity for cruelty, particularly when that capacity is combined with power, intelligence, and the ability to rationalize immoral actions. It also reminds us of the equally human capacity for courage, resistance, and survival against overwhelming odds. The most disturbing aspect of the Turner case may be not its exceptional nature, but the systemic context that enabled it. Eleanor Turner did not act in a vacuum, but within a broader society that had already accepted the fundamental dehumanization of enslaved people. Her experiments represented not a departure from the logic of slavery, but its extension to a terrible conclusion. As we continue to reckon with the legacies of slavery and its aftermath in American society, cases like that of the Turner plantation serve as stark reminders of how systems of oppression corrupt not only those who are oppressed, but also those who benefit from and participate in the oppression. The damage extends in all directions, though never equally. The full truth of what occurred at the Turner plantation will never be known with certainty. Too many voices were silenced, too many records lost or never created, too many experiences unrecorded. What remains is a partial accounting, assembled from fragments, enough to outline the horror but insufficient to capture its entirety. Perhaps that incompleteness is itself fitting. The Turner case, like the broader history of which it is a part, resists neat resolution or comfortable distance. It continues to unsettle, to raise questions, to demand acknowledgement. In that persistent discomfort lies its most valuable lesson, that the past is never fully past, that understanding requires continuous engagement, and that remembering is an act of both witness and warning. Today, the land where the Turner plantation once stood has been transformed by time and development. No physical trace remains visible to the casual observer. Yet for those who know the history, the landscape is forever altered by knowledge of what occurred there. Some shadows linger beyond the reach of sunlight. Some stories continue to demand telling, even when their conclusion brings no comfort. Eleanor Turner's final written words, found on that single preserved page in the Montgomery County archives, have been analyzed by generations of scholars seeking insight into her motivations and mindset. They think the greatest pain lies in physical suffering, but I have found it lives in the mind, in the spaces between what was and what might be. These words have been variously interpreted as confession, justification, or simple observation. Perhaps they are all of these things, or none of them, none of. What is certain is that Eleanor Turner recognized a fundamental truth about human psychology, that mental suffering can equal or exceed physical pain, and deliberately weaponized that knowledge. In doing so, she prefigured techniques that would later be refined and deployed in various contexts throughout history. Her private experimentation foreshadowed more systematic applications of psychological manipulation. The Turner case stands as a reminder that scientific inquiry divorced from ethical constraint can become not a path to human advancement, but a justification for profound human damage. It reminds us that the designation of any group as less than fully human opens the door to atrocities justified as something other than what they are. As the sun sets over Montgomery today, the landscape bears little resemblance to what existed in 1851. The cotton fields are gone, the plantation houses demolished or transformed, the legal system fundamentally altered. Yet beneath these changes, certain continuities persist, in patterns of remembering and forgetting, in questions of who counts and who does not, in the ongoing struggle to fully acknowledge the humanity of all people. The story of the Turner plantation endures not because it is exceptional, but because it is emblematic. In its details, we find specificity, but in its broader outlines, we recognize patterns that extend beyond a single time and place. It serves as both history and warning, a reminder of what becomes possible when we fail to recognize ourselves in others. And so the record remains incomplete, but not silent. The voices partially recovered, but not fully restored. The truth glimpsed, but never fully captured. What happened at the Turner plantation in the spring of 1851 continues to echo across time, a reminder of depths to which humanity can descend and the heights to which it can rise even in the face of calculated cruelty. Some doors once opened can never truly be closed again. Some stories, once begun, never reach a comfortable conclusion. Some wounds, though scarred over by time, continue to shape the body that bears them. In acknowledging these uncomfortable truths lies our best hope of ensuring that such horrors remain firmly in the past rather than prefiguring the future.